How do you build Thea? The way that I chose personally was building around the legendary wand Jumble Ice, which gives you a lot of additional bonuses for stacking Focus Blessing. Thea is the blessing character, so it's far easier to stack blessings on her, since you can stack Agility, Tenacity, and Focus Blessing, then gain additional maximum Focus Blessings for each maximum Tenacity and Agility blessing you have. It's important to note, the base 4 are not counted as these are not maximum. And so I began a very long journey of making a build on Thea. And I have some good news and some bad news. The good news first. If you like playing an Ice Nova Occultist in Path of Exile, or you like the feel of dual void batteries, this is going to be very similar. The bad news is, like a well-made dual void battery character, it's also not going to be cheap. I have no idea what the price of Jumble Ice will be when you watch this video. Luckily though, the skill that I'm playing on Thea is Icy Ring, and you don't need Jumble Ice for it to function. Instead, you can scale it more traditionally, with spell damage, spell level, and added damage to spells. If you do this, then you'll be able to use Thea to farm up the currency to buy the Jumble Ice. So don't expect to jump in and play something similar to my build immediately, unless you have a pretty large budget. Instead, be ready to adapt things and work your way up. Don't treat this build showcase as a rule. It's not the 10 Commandments, it's just a few guidelines, and we all know what to do with guidelines. So first, why Icy Ring? Well, that's a very good question, because originally this was a Ring of Blades build. But to use Ring of Blades with Jumble Ice, I'm now scaling channeling stuff, I'm now scaling max focus blessing, and I'm now fizz converting, which means I need to have about 5 different full talent trees, which, at least right now, isn't possible, and as much as I would have liked an infinity with all the nodes that I wanted, I never found one, and I'm fairly sure that it doesn't exist. Plus, the hitbox on Ring of Blades is a little bit wonky, though channeling while moving is quite nice. Then I moved on to Ice Lances. At first, Ice Lances felt incredibly good. After all, if you're just hitting a dummy, Ice Lances is one of the best skills in the game. Unfortunately, once you're hitting enemies that spread out and can fight back, forcing you to move, it also feels pretty awkward, since you have to drop a frost pool beneath the enemy. You want to be standing farther back for your optimal Ice Lancing distance to be out of harm's way, and you have to move in because frost pool's cast range is shorter than your Ice Lance projectile range. So I scrapped that idea as well, because while it was somewhat effective, it also wasn't very fun. From there, I experimented with a lot of cold skills. Even as Ice Lances, I'd been using Icy Ring to level up, since the clear felt so much better. And I also messed with Icebound Laser, since I heard the laser skills sucked, but wanted to try for myself. As it turns out, the laser skills aren't very good at clear. With Refraction and an Explodey Chest, I ended up with something that ultimately was only moderately painful when clearing, and the single target, once I switched out the Refraction for a higher damage support, was honestly really good. So were the defenses. The build felt super tanky, and it could absolutely melt T8 bosses. So build success, right? I mean, I guess if I just wanted to sit there and channel on bosses, build success. But if I just wanted to sit there and channel on bosses, I could probably save myself a lot of a hassle by playing Whirlwind and retaining my ability to actually clear. So I went back to Icy Ring and decided, this may be a money pit, but let's see if I can turn the damage up to 11. That ended up going pretty well for me, actually. So I present to you my Jumble Ice Icy Ring Thea. Now first off, Icy Ring itself. Icy Ring is basically Ice Nova from Path of Exile, or Ice Nova from pretty much any other game. A nice old expanding ring of cold damage that hits really hard. The nice thing about Icy Ring is if you kill an enemy, you'll then cast an additional Icy Ring on a nearby enemy. So quite often your Icy Rings will proliferate through packs, creating a very nice explodey effect. It also has an innate frostbite chance, which makes it pretty easy to freeze, and therefore automatically reset frigid transmission. But of course, that's not really why you're here. You're really here for Jumble Ice. Jumble Ice gives you spell damage, added cold damage to spells, and spell critical strike rating per focus blessing. It also gives you +1 maximum focus blessing stacks, and a chance to gain focus blessing on hit. If you're hitting quickly, this means you'll instantly refill your focus blessings after Thea consumes them. Jumble Ice offers you a lot of damage. Just think about it this way. I have 2 of them, so I could have up to 60% spell damage per stack of focus blessing owned. And with my imperfect gear, I have 16. I'm pretty sure with perfect gear, I'd top out at 18 or 19. Let's just say 16 and be conservative. That's 960% increased spell damage. Never mind all the added cold dispels and all the other nice goodies that come along with it. But how am I getting so many blessings? Well, if you watch my Thea guide, you'd know that one of her traits means that for every maximum tenacity or agility blessing, you also gain a maximum focus blessing, allowing you to double dip on your blessings. As a note, if you want to know more about that, a video will be in the card. So I'm using End of Confusion for both of my rings, giving me a total of +3 agility and tenacity blessings per ring. In other words, I'm getting about +6 blessings per ring, since the +2 agility, +1 tenacity, or +2 tenacity, +1 agility end up also being +3 focus. This, in combination with Steel Vanguard, that gives me another 3 blessings, is why I'm able to scale them so ridiculously high. For my defenses, well, I'm a low life shield build, so most of my defenses are coming from the Light Hunter belt. If you want to know more about how the Light Hunter belt works, I have a dedicated video which will also be in the card. Please do watch that before trying to make this build for yourself, and do make sure you understand Light Hunter, as otherwise you might be confused as to why you feel so squishy and you're dying all the time. Finally, my last defense is Fizz Taken As. I take 25% of physical damage as erosion damage. Then I take an additional 35% of physical damage as elemental damage. Meaning I take 60% of Fizz as non-Fizz, so my resistances, which are 80, 77, 77, 77, naturally apply to most of the damage that I take, including the non-physical stuff. I also have a little bit of armor, which definitely helps with a minimal amount of Fizz damage that I do still take. It doesn't mean I won't be one-shot by Uber Keegan, a lot of his abilities just bypass your defenses, but it does mean that I feel super tanky and don't really have to worry about any of the other bosses in the game. So now let's get into a little bit more about my skills, hero traits, talents, and gearing. Starting with Icy Ring. Like I mentioned before, Icy Ring creates a ring of damage around you, and each enemy killed has a chance to trigger another ring. Since I cast super fast, there are tons of Icy Rings going off all the time. For supports, I experimented a lot here. What ended up feeling best to me was Efficient Cast, Mark, Overload, Cold Piercing, and Crit Strike Increase. Crit Strike Increase and Cold Piercing are honestly very situational in regards to your gear. And Efficient Casting numerically might not even be the best option, it just felt really good to have a super high cast speed. I would however suggest keeping both Mark and Overload, as Mark adds a ton of damage, and Overload scales really well if you have a bunch of focus blessings. Now, most of my support skills are triggered on a Death Pact. There are a couple that aren't though. The first is Mana Boil, which I'm linking to Mass Effect and Mania to make it as powerful as possible. For my mobility, I'm using Frigid Transmission with quick mobility and cooldown reduction. My Icy Ring very often freezes, and I'm using wands, so my skills are limited here and Frigid Transmission resets pretty frequently. For my curse, I'm using a blind setup with Abysmal Hatred and Terrain of Malice. If you want to drop the Terrain of Malice, you can, but I suggest going curse support on your main skill if that's the case, so that you can keep it up more on bosses. The reason I went with blind is, well, I wanted additional defenses, and I felt like my damage was high enough, though you could easily replace this with a damage curse if you preferred. Just do be aware that sometimes bosses might hit a little bit harder. For my defensive skill, I'm using Force Start. Remember, my charging can't be interrupted, so if I get chunked down, I can always hit Force Start and instantly start to heal, and I won't stop healing until I'm full health. Now for the next section, pay close attention. It's going to be easy to get these auras wrong, cause I'm using a lot of them. Starting off with Death Pact, which I've linked to Fixate, Soul-Eating Circle, and Secret Origin Unleash. This is because I have quite a bit of mana, and I can get the cast speed, the spell damage, and the chance to deal double damage, making all of these pretty ideal supports. The only problem, this does take up quite a bit of mana, which is why I have so much sealed mana reduction in my talents, though a little bit more about that later. Additionally on my mana, I'm running Precise Elemental Amplification, Summon Thunder Spirit, Precise Frigid Domain, Precise Steadfast, Swiftness, and Stand as One. Stand as One is interesting because each aura gains aura effect for being linked to a bunch of other supported skills. So you'll always want to use this in a 6-link aura setup if at all possible. That's basically why I have the Steadfast here. If you're a little shorter on mana, don't worry about the Steadfast, it is absolutely not necessary. And if you can't afford Precise skills, because you're just starting out, also don't worry about those. Precise is just an additional bonus, it's better than the normal version, but not required. Though I would try to get a Precise Elemental Resistance, if at all possible, for the 2% max res. I know it says 1 here, but with Aura Effect, it does bump up to 2 for me. This is a low life build, I'm using Shield, so I'm running Precise Elemental Resistance, Precise Energy Fortress, and Precise Magical Source on my life. In general, you want lower reservation auras on your life and or flat reservations, since you'll more often have higher life than mana. In this case, I actually couldn't fit most of my other flat stuff onto my life, so I ended up doing this because that's what made everything fit perfectly. Feel free to experiment for yourself since your life and mana values won't be exactly identical to mine. At tier 32, I went with Predicted Harvest. This is because it ended up being quite a bit of extra damage due to the chance to deal double damage doubled within 4 seconds. I believe this puts me at a 100% chance to deal double damage. Though Predicted Judgment isn't too bad either, as that will reduce the damage enemies deal, so if you get a bit more cooldown reduction than I have, it should feel really, really good. I'd actually switch to Predicted Judgment if I got a little more cooldown reduction, but my gear didn't end up supporting it, probably because I made a mistake in crafting and got a little bit too greedy aiming for raw damage. For tier 62, I tried Predicted Hope. It felt really bad. So just go Predicted Sacrifice. This will immediately restore both your agility and tenacity blessings as you consume focus blessings. You generate focus blessings super quickly, so those will also be instantly restored. And then for tier 80, you absolutely need Predicted Justice. This is what the whole build is built around. The increases and reductions, yes, this is the same for both mods. To agility and tenacity blessing also apply to focus blessing. That's what lets you double dip on those really sweet rings. Next up, I want to talk about talents and gearing. Before I do though, a quick reminder that if you're enjoying the video, maybe you found it helpful, be sure to leave a like as that really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. If you want to know what else I'm playing, then get subscribed as I'm either going to be doing a Carino build next or getting sidetracked with a second Thea build. We'll see how the cards fall in that one. As always, if you're confused about something, there are a lot of additional resources to check out in the video card, which is located to the top right. Before I get back to things, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support, but more about how you can support at the end. For now, let's start talking about talents. First off, I started with Goddess of Knowledge. The reason I wanted to start with Goddess of Knowledge is to solve all of my mana problems via preparation. I figured with the number of focus blessings that I'd have, I'd never have to worry about mana if I took this, and spoiler alert, you still need Magical Source. But otherwise I was right. This also gives me a nice advantage of getting +1 spell skill level or +1 to maximum focus blessing. If I were a couple levels higher, I'd probably have both, but I wanted to grab the sealed mana as I felt that was really important. Aside of that, I mostly just focused on shield and cast speed. I figured the build would do enough damage anyway, so I might as well focus defensively rather than getting increased damage, which won't add all that much since I get so much from my weapons. And of course, next up was Magister. It seemed like the obvious choice. With how many focus blessings I have, Bunch is an absurd amount of damage. Plus, combining it with Play Safe felt really, really good. Though I will admit, Play Safe is somewhat awkward at times, and Barrier of Radiance is a surprisingly effective alternative when paired with a high damage Infinity Belt. So do experiment a little bit and try this for yourself. If you have Barrier of Radiance, you will be able to drop Light Hunter. Personally, I ultimately ended up going with Play Safe, but I do think Barrier of Radiance could be the better option if I got a good Infinity. I just hadn't gotten that lucky yet. In terms of the rest of the talents, I again mostly just went for cast speed, quality of life, and a little bit of damage here and there. Things like Paralysis, always good to increase enemy damage taken, and with 16 focus blessings, this is a whole lot of crit strike damage. Now, my final talent choice might be a little bit unorthodox, and that is Steel Vanguard. Steel Vanguard often gets overlooked because it's primarily a defensive tree. It doesn't make your numbers get bigger, but it will definitely help keep you alive on bosses. Everything from Fizz Taken As, a little bit of extra erosion res, so I just didn't need to worry about it on gear. Of course, lots of aura effect and sealed mana, plus this talent. +1 maximum tenacity, +1 maximum agility, +1 maximum focus, which effectively means +3 maximum focus since I am Thea. I also get reflection for 20% aura effect, though you can also take resistance. The main reason that I didn't is I also have poison immunity. Poison immunity gives you maximum erosion res and 25% of physical damage and elemental damage taken converted to erosion damage. So that means a lot of the fizz damage you take is applied to your erosion res, which is now 80%, thus giving you an 80% reduction against a good amount of a fizz damage that you take. The reason that I opted for reflection over resistance is it just ultimately felt a little better. It's personal choice, and it really depends on how much aura effect you have on your gear. With more damage pierces elemental resistance on gear, you want reflection. With more aura effect, you want resistance. Feel free to swap between both, and if you have a way to work in barrier, curtain probably wouldn't be wrong either. Also, if you want a handy reference for the talents and some of the stuff that I'm using, be sure to hop into my Discord. I have a Torchlight Infinite channel where I'll try to remember to pin a comment with a build of my character, though that might go up slightly after the video releases. For now, what are the items that I used, and more importantly, why am I using them? Well, I've already covered the dual Jumble Ice, the End of Confusion, and the Light Hunter, so most of the bottom part of my gearing is already taken care of earlier in the video. If you haven't seen that, do go back and watch it. It is important, and if you don't know what's going on there, you may end up with a build that feels pretty bad. The last legendary that I'm using is Sage's Insight. That's because this has an absolutely massive amount of energy shield on it, especially for a pair of gloves, gives +1 to spell skill level, a good bit of damage and cast speed, and res shred. I never really ended up working fire and lightning spell damage into my build, so it's really just 18% cold res shred, but it is 18% res shred still, and on top of all the ES and damage, it's really hard to replace these with a rare. On the other hand, my boots are hard to replace for a different reason. I ended up crafting them with double T1 ES, erosion res since that's the res that I really needed, +1 to cold skill level, which ended up becoming the Ember mod of +2 cold skill level, 11% aura effect, and 31 to 40% move speed, own 1 additional stack of agility blessing, which feels pretty good, let me tell you. The main goal with both the boots and the helmet was to get as much shield as possible. And so my helmet has, unsurprisingly, shield, some erosion res, crit damage, and of course aura effect. With how many auras I'm running, aura effect is an incredibly powerful stat. Now my chest piece is one of the only items I didn't craft myself. I bought this as is, and it was pretty inexpensive, probably because the 8% of max mana added as energy shield isn't that good. Then I corrupted it and hit 40% gear energy shield, which, honestly, I'll take it as a result. I did try to double corrupt it, but it didn't hit the double. The fizz taken converted to cold, cast speed, and aura effect all felt really good. The curse effect I'd probably replace with all Ellie res so that I could drop the Ellie res from my amulet. Speaking of, here's my amulet. It's got damage piercing. This could ideally be sealed mana so I don't need it on the helmet. Then I could have, I believe, fizz taken as on the helmet. Damage per stack of blessing could easily be something else like crit multi. The erosion res is very necessary, and plus cold skill level is, of course, very good for scaling damage. Jumble Ice gives a ton of flat damage. Jumble Ice gives a ton of increased damage. It doesn't really give gem levels, so gem levels everywhere else is super important to the build. When it comes to all of these rares, I made most of them myself. I started with a base, and I ended up rolling for whatever felt like the rarest first. In the case of most of the pieces, it was the erosion res, since there's usually a lot of resists. Now in the case of the amulet, I bought one with the elemental resistance. That made it quite a bit easier to roll. Now for the boots, there's one important thing to note when you're trying to craft it for yourself. The 31% move speed mod shares a mod group with regular move speed on boots. So to avoid wasting extra restless embers, where the mod that you want tries to override the aura effect or erosion res, make sure that your suffixes are erosion res, aura effect, and any tier of move speed. I suggest slamming this on as your 6th mod since you're not picky about the tiers. Then, when you hit it with the restless embers, which does cost 20 flame elementium plus the ember itself per attempt, as soon as you hit 31% move speed, own 1 additional stack of agility blessing, it can only replace the move speed, thus making the item far easier to craft. For something like the chest piece, I'm sure there's a fairly similar thing that can be done, but I didn't end up having to do that since I just bought this chest for cheap off of someone on the auction house. Shout out to whoever sold this for 90 FE, it probably would have cost way more than that to craft. I already knew my build had a lot of damage, so for all my rares, the goal really was just to get as much shield as possible and a little bit of extra defenses via aura effect. And so how does the build play? Much like an Ice Nova Occultist, you mostly run around maps, going from pack to pack, as your icy rings chain off into the distance. In a low density map, it honestly doesn't feel too great. In a high density map, it feels excellent. So try to pack as many monsters into your maps as possible. When you're fighting bosses, AoE is a surprisingly effective stat. I've done almost everything the game has to offer. The only fight that I didn't get down on this character was Uber Keegan, and that had more to do with the fact that after trying it once, with Ice Lances, mind you, when my build was far weaker, had half the investment and half the energy shield, I decided the fight just isn't that fun, and if I'm going to make a character to farm it, I'm probably going to overwhelm it with massive damage. If I even end up doing that at all, because it didn't sound like too fun of an experience. With around 7.8k shield, I do feel super tanky. I have a lot of layered damage reductions, and I have absolutely superb recovery between Light Hunter and Forced Start. I think it's entirely possible that dropping Light Hunter, grabbing Barrier of Radiance, and grabbing yourself a good Infinity could be the way to go on this build. I just didn't find one, and a lot of people have been asking me how my build's coming along, so I didn't want to delay just to fish for the perfect item that might not exist for days or even weeks. This build isn't really what I set out to make, but that doesn't make it bad. It feels very much like a power charge stacking Ice Nova Occultist from Path of Exile, pops and all. Which means if you want to map quickly, it's a great time. If you want to freeze bosses, it's a pretty good time. And if you want a super tanky shield build, it's a great time. Just keep in mind, if you're trying to make it on a budget, you'll have to do a lot of adaptation. And as a reminder, if you're trying to do this on a budget, you'll have to build it totally differently, since a lot of the choices that I'm making are to optimize around Jumble Ice. Maybe check out the hero ranking and see what other people are doing on Thea. For now though, I only have one question. What other PoE build archetypes have you enjoyed playing in Torchlight Infinite? Let me know some of your thoughts down in the comments below. And before I go, another special thanks to my patrons and channel members. For as low as $1 a month, you can make videos just like this one possible. And your support especially matters on these longer ones because oh boy did this take a while to put together. If you have any more questions, feel free to join the conversation by hopping into my Discord, react to give yourself a community role, and you should be good to start chatting. For more content, YouTube has a recommendation on screen right now, or you can check out some of the resources in the card, where I talk about Thea, the Light Hunter belt, other mechanics in Torchlight Infinite, and a video from my second channel talking about why I like some of my favorite city builders. For now, thanks for watching. And if you try Jumble Ice for yourself, good luck trying to hit 20 focus blessings. Apparently, when you do, the world tears open and bosses explode.